In this episode, I'm joined by Khandro Déchen, Lineage Lama, alongside her husband and teaching partner Ngak'chang Rinpoche, of the gTér tantric householder tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. We learn about Khandro Déchen's upbringing and career in nursing, and how working with the sick and dying prepared her for her role as a spiritual teacher. We discuss Khandro Déchen's first meeting and subsequent courtship with the man who would later become both her teacher and husband, Ngak'chang Rinpoche. We learn about Khandro Déchen's practice in the hidden places of the Himalayas and her contact with great Lamas such as Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche. Khandro Déchen also discusses power differentials between teacher and student, female teachers and the Patriarchy, her love of Kum-Nye physical practices, and much more. So without further ado, Khandro Déchen. Khandro Déchen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
So I'm curious if you could say a little bit about your upbringing and how it was you became interested in Buddhism and things of that nature.
Well, I had a fairly average childhood, I would say. I don't really think it had anything to do with precipitating me into my life as it is now as a Buddhist practitioner. Both my parents had quite a lot of religion when they were children. They had to go to church several times on Sunday. And that put them off, and they didn't, when they came to their own adult lives, they didn't see a need to continue that, and they didn't see a need to give it to my sister and I. So they didn't really project us into a religious life at all. I mean, I say us because my sister is also a committed Buddhist practitioner. She's 3 years older than me, and we both came to it independently of each other, really. I remember when I was a child, well, probably when I was about 12 or 13, having a period where I was fascinated with churches, with the buildings and what went on inside them. And that led to me actually going to a church service on a Sunday with my mother, just one time, just to explore that really, and to see what it felt like. But it didn't really lead to anything. I expect it was my own projection. I didn't feel particularly like I belonged there. They were very friendly, but I didn't feel a sense of home there. So my landing up as a Buddhist came about entirely by accident. I suppose my early, my adolescence and teenage into adulthood was concerned with studying, and my time was filled up really with riding horses and studying. And then when I went to university, I came to Cardiff and did a degree in nursing. That really filled my time, because it was one of those early nursing degrees. I think they're a lot better established now than they were. And our time was very much filled with studying and also with the practical nature of nursing. So it was in a way not like an ordinary degree. It was based in the medical school, so we were based with medical students and dental students, and but we spent a lot of time in practical work as well as studying. So my time was filled. So I think when I got my first job, there was a bit more space. And I happened to see on a hospital notice board an advert for a Tai Chi class. So I thought, well, that sounds interesting. And I was ready to look for something other than studying and work then. So I joined that class, and I think that's how mine came into it, because I met my first husband there, who was a friend of Ngak'chang Rinpoche. So that's how I came into his sort of social circle, really. So that was my first contact. We used to have gatherings, obviously, social gatherings, parties. And I was fascinated with my husband's friend, this man who just returned from 10 years in India studying and practicing. And I spoke to him a lot at parties. I would sort of corner him and ask him about his experiences. And he then showed me all his slides, his photographs, of which he had thousands. And he was starting to teach then at that point. And I went on I think I went on the first retreat that he gave at the Lam Rim Buddhist Centre, which is in Raglan in Monmouthshire, not so far from here. And that was it. It was amazing, an amazing sort of revelation of sense making for me. And from there, it just went on. So that's how I sort of fell into it, really.
This was the early 80s, is that?
Yes.
Yeah, 81,
yeah,
something like that.
I came to Cardiff to start studying in 1978 when I was 18, yeah. Finished in 82, so it would have been around 82, 83 that I first met Ngak'chang Rinpoche.
And that was your first contact with Buddhism? You went from the Tai Chi class to...
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it was, yeah. I'd never thought about looking for a religion or an alternative sort of religion since that time I mentioned in my teens when I was exploring the possibility of religion. After that, I kind of forgot about it.
What do you think was it specifically about that first retreat and the scene in general that had that sense-making quality? Can you recall?
Well, I suppose it was the explanation of how we create our own problems. You know, our constant relationship with this commentator that goes on in the back of your head constantly, and the result of that. And how our lives change. Life is not static. And I suppose I'd gone through a fair amount of change during my degree. I think I was quite a shy person when I arrived in Cardiff, all through my adolescence. I was quite painfully shy, I would say. I think I inherited that from my mother. But to become a nurse, you can't be shy. You have to step outside yourself. And so I had changed quite a lot in those 4 years of studying. And I think that was it was the sense making of that. And I enjoyed my career, you know. And I think it was just the sense making of where I was at that point in my life.
How long did you practice nursing for?
Total of 12 years in the end. I mean, I know that because I've just got my pension for those 12 years, which seems ridiculous to get a pension for just 12 years of service. But yes, I started off in general nursing in cardiology, moved into cardiac surgery and coronary care. I mean, I liked the technical aspects of nursing. And I also liked the fact that in those high dependency areas of nursing, you could have a one-to-one relationship with a patient instead of being in charge of a group. So you had more time to spend with people who were facing, you know, profound changes in their health. I became very interested in cardiac rehabilitation, actually. And then I think that was what led me then, after a few years, to go into health visiting, because I think I thought I could set up some sort of cardiac rehabilitation for people who'd had cardiac surgery or heart attack. actually that didn't work. I went into health visiting. I think I've always had this need to feel needed, and health visiting was probably the worst area of nursing to go into, in the sense of there is this vague sense that you're keeping a watching eye on families, and I found that difficult. I didn't enjoy it. So then I had another idea about what I would do, and that was to go into cancer nursing and to go into hospice care. And when I was a health visitor, I decided that what I wanted to do was work in the community as a symptom control nurse, a Macmillan nurse, a specialist nurse in palliative care. So then I set about arranging my career to do that. I mean, in those days, nursing was the sort of thing you could move around in a lot. There were a lot of choices. It wasn't very limited. You could change jobs very easily in the 80s and 90s. I don't think it's the same now. I think things have closed down a lot more in terms of your options and how the ease with which you can move between jobs. So that's what I ended up as in my last 7 years of nursing. I was a palliative care specialist nurse, and I covered 3 Welsh valleys. I mean, I was advising GPs and district nurses how about symptom control of people who were being cared for at home, how to cope with side effects of treatment, and also counselling and teaching nurses particularly how to communicate with people at that stage in their lives.
What are some of the important principles that you were teaching at that time to the nurses in terms of communication specifically? Because I think palliative care and end-of-life situations are notoriously, people notoriously do the opposite of the right thing. It's a little counterintuitive things I've heard.
Yeah, yes. Well, it's painful to talk about it. So that's why people don't want to talk about it. I think the principle, well, at least that was what I was taught. We did this care of the dying course, COD course. I must have done that at some point when I was working in inpatient cancer care. And we were taught there the principle of talking with, putting the client in charge, really, going where they wanted to go in terms of communication. So if they wanted to be completely open about the fact they were going to die and plan how that was going to be, plan their own way of managing their symptoms at the end, then that's where we would go. But if they didn't want to go there, if they weren't happy to go there, what you did was provide every single opportunity you could for them to go there if they felt able. So that was the basic principle. It was entirely client-led. I learned so much about people during, the whole of my nursing career. I think that's been so useful to me in my present position as teaching partner with Ngak'chang Rinpoche, because people have never ceased to fascinate me with how they can live some people can live in a complete state of denial, and that is all they can tolerate, particularly in relation to bad news, having bad news, because I would accompany patients to their hospital appointments sometimes. I'd meet them there, go in, so that I knew exactly what they'd been told by the doctor about their diagnosis, and then I would discuss it with them afterwards, and they had a completely different version of the event than I did. So you can see how people's defense mechanisms came into play. And I think that, that's helped me enormously with people in a Buddhist context, because I think a lot of us, the nature of duality is that we don't live with reality. We live with a version of reality that we can cope with and deal with and are comfortable with. So I think this principle that I learned when I was nursing these seriously ill people is something that's really helped me to understand why I react the way I do and why people in general do. So I'm really grateful to have had that experience at this point.
In the same way, there are different ways to communicate with people with a cancer diagnosis, depending on what they can handle talking about and which defense mechanisms are in operation. Do you also find yourself then adjusting the way you relate to or talk to your students, depending on what they can handle and which defense mechanisms are active? And if so, what are some of those variations in the way you might approach things?
Well, yes. There is never any point in telling someone about themselves if they're not in a position where they can hear it, because that produces resentment and denial. And so you have to have a feel for how much someone can deal with hearing about themselves, unless of course they're being unkind to someone. I think we're not going to beat about the bush about that. We're just going to say you just have to stop that. That's not on. And you know, in a sangha of roughly 200 people, you can get disagreements between people and people not getting on and not being able to function with the end result of the good of the project in mind. And yet people with their particular part in the project becomes their kingdom, and they identify with it, and they can't bear someone else to be to step in who's perhaps more useful. So there's a fair amount of that we have to deal with sometimes. I guess the best way to teach is always to be a role model, rather than, you can't always say it or teach it, you have to be it. I think that's a much stronger way of teaching than words very often.
That's interesting. How did your sister discover Buddhism and go down that road? You said it happened quite independently of you.
Yes. Well, my sister lives in America and has done all her adult life, actually. She did a student exchange when she was doing her degree in Brighton. She did a degree in psychology, and she did this year's exchange, then she came back and finished her degree and went straight back out there. So I'm not entirely, I mean, in those, when she was quite a young adult, we weren't very much in communication, but so because she doesn't live in this country and we didn't have that much communication in that period, I'm not quite sure how she came to it, but she went to the place in Massachusetts, Barre, Massachusetts, the Insight Meditation Center, huge center, and started going there regularly, and then helped out on the retreats there, and was part of the service for the nuns there when they were on retreat. So that's how she began. But she goes to visit different Lamas teachings when she's got time. She's working full time, and she also comes to our retreats now as well, which is lovely. So when we go over there, which of course we're not able to travel at the moment, she will come and join the apprentice retreats.
Is that strange, having your older sister in your retreat?
Well, yeah, I suppose you might think, yes, from the outside it might be, but it seems to be perfectly natural. We're still sisters, and that very much pervades the atmosphere that we have between us, but we're very much closer now than we were when we were younger. I guess that's because we have this shared interest. So it's really lovely having her there. Yeah, it's great.
So in 81, at 21, you became involved in Ngak'chang Rinpoche's activities. I suppose at that time it wasn't gTér still, or was it gTér at that point?
Well, Sangnak Chödzong, it's always been called. Fortress of Secret Mantra. And that was the name given to Ngak'chang Rinpoche by Dudjom Rinpoche, who initially suggested that he could develop this opportunity for people to practice in this way, in the Ngak'chang Rinpoche way, the Ngakpang Sangha. So that was the name that was given to it then. So it wasn't really, gTér wasn't so apparent at that time, no.
And so what happened in those next 10 years? I suppose you became the Sangyom of Ngak'chang Rinpoche in 1992 and married in 1995. So what happened, but when you came in at 21, you were already married. What happened in that next 11 years? What unfolded there?
Oh, just more and more, attending more and more retreats, really. The Sangha got slightly bigger, but only in incrementally small numbers gradually in those 11 years. It became a gradually more international Sangha as Rinpoche started to travel to the USA, both coasts, on the East Coast and the West Coast. And he started to travel more in Europe as well. And I mean, there was just three of us, really, 3 or 4 of us in the beginning, which by the time we got together, I suppose it was maybe about, I'm thinking it could have been 80, 90, 100 perhaps by then. But it was very odd how Rinpoche and I came to be together, because, you know, for those 11 years, when I was his student, just like everyone else, we just had a normal student-teacher relationship. I think the atmosphere when you're with your teacher is always heightened anyway. It's a kind of a particular time, those times that you spend alone with your teacher in learning. There's a communication that's going on between you that's not necessarily verbal as well, because you're normally in a sort of heightened state of well, I suppose you're trying to be in a state of openness, aren't you? I suppose gradually my marriage came to an end and we divorced. And I think once that came to an end, I suppose there was more openness on my part to realizing that well, I liked him in a different way. And it was, I suppose we had some odd moments where we used to go to Pennant Valley and have a camping retreat once a year at Shiva O'Brien's place with all these teepees. We'd go there for a week and spend a retreat. And I just remember some odd moments when it was obvious that there was something more between us from my point of view. When we would, when I arrived, I think I remember striding across the field, because you had to walk a bit to get to the encampment from where you could park your car. And there was something really odd about the way that I was walking towards Rinpoche and he was coming from the other side of the field. We were walking towards each other, and it was, you know, you could visualize this sort of romantic film of us coming together, walking across this field. Because Rinpoche was in this position of teacher to me, so he was in a position of power, it wasn't possible for him to really make a move. So I suppose I perhaps realized this, and so I did then make the move on him by, he was just off, he was about to go off to America, and he was in London staying overnight with one of the Sangha members before going to the airport the next morning. And I just had this feeling that I had to say something before we went to America in case something else happened while he was in America and someone else made a move on him. So I did this journey after my shift working. So I didn't get there till quite late. Drove all the way to London and said that I'm coming down and I've got something to ask you. So then we went for this walk, and we walked all around London, some nearby London streets, and we ended up on Primrose Hill. We walked into the park where Primrose Hill is, which is a very beautiful part of London. And we sat down on the grass overlooking looking out across the city, and that's when I actually said that I loved him in a romantic way. And he very sweetly said, "That's the nicest thing that anyone's ever said to me." So it's lovely. But I was aware that I had to make that statement. And I think that, in he obviously said yes. I think he actually at that moment acknowledged that, oh, well, a relationship with you probably means children, having children, because I think he knew that I ultimately wanted to have children, although I hadn't had any up until then because I was too busy with my career, really. And, perhaps I didn't really feel as if I was in a safe enough relationship to have children at that time. So that was the sort of the end of those 11 years when we finally got together.
You mentioned the power differential between teacher and student. There is a notion that power differential makes any relationship unviable, even if the move is made by the student to the teacher. Correlations are drawn to the therapist-client relationship, or the doctor-patient relationship, or the lawyer-client relationship, I suppose. Mm-hmm. That, particularly in America, I think this notion is there, whereby it doesn't matter how much the patient declares their interest in the GP can't go there, or the therapist, can't go there. Mm-hmm. The idea being that the relationship, the structure, the power differential there makes the student incapable of making an informed decision about it. I think that's the sort of rationale. Well, that's the rationale to some degree. What do you think of that notion, given how things came together between the two of you? And you've been married now for how many years, or you've been together for how many years? I suppose we can do the math, can't we?
Yes, well, you can do that.
20.
You're good at maths, I'm not.
30 years.
Our 25th wedding anniversary, I think.
When was that?
April the 6th.
Oh, this year?
Yes.
25 years, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, yes, I entirely understand what you mean and where you're coming from. I think the first, if I just speak of my experience of the relationship, the first 6 months to a year were not easy for me, in that I was, well, they weren't easy for either of us, really. I was projecting a sort of power onto Ngak'chang Rinpoche that really wasn't there. As soon as we entered this relationship, he really did step back from instructing me in terms of telling me what to do. Which, in some ways, then you could say, oh, well, you've lost your teacher then, haven't you? That's another thing. But I think the first 6 months to a year were quite difficult because I was projecting power onto something that wasn't there. I was seeing it in everything. I can give you one just tiny example. we went on holiday once to the one of the Outer Hebridean Islands. I can't remember the name of it now, but and we were writing postcards home while we were on holiday, and I'd addressed my postcards with the address as I normally write it, postcode and then county or whatever. And he wrote on the bottom of my postcards, England or Wales, Great Britain. And he finished off my addresses, which is just something he did as a whimsy. It was just a funny thing. But I remember having a huge reaction to that. Well, he's rubber stamped my addresses. He's entered into, I saw it as a correction, which it wasn't at all. But that's just one example of what I projected onto him. I think Rinpoche stepped back entirely so that I could learn to see that in myself, what I was doing. And after that, it just became so much easier. And I mean, Rinpoche is not a person who gives very many direct instructions anyway. I think he's very careful not to give direct instruction to people if there's any chance that they will not carry out that instruction. In other words, break that root vow, which we, ordained practitioners live by the 14 root vows. And if you give someone an instruction, a direct instruction, it's known as a Vajra command. And it's something you really need to carry out, unless there's a good reason for you not to be able to do it, which you can discuss with your Lama, but you really should carry out those Vajra instructions. So he's very careful not to give them. If there's any chance that it will cause a problem in you not being able to keep that root vow. So, I mean, he's always encouraged me in certain directions, certainly. And it's up to me to find the teacher in that. I think he's always left that very much up to me to find my way. I mean, he's always wanted me to teach more. And it's taken me a very long time to start to go there, really. I'm not a person of many words. I mean, probably my dear father would have said, you haven't got the gift of the gab, and actually to sit next to someone like Ngak'chang Rinpoche who can ooze the teachings, they just ooze out of him. And it doesn't come as easily to me at all. And I often think, well, why would people want to listen to me when he can put things so much better? But of course, they want to hear me speak. They want to hear a woman teach. Of course, I understand that. But so that's something he's always encouraged me with a lot, but he hasn't pushed me. He's always just drawn me on. And I guess that's the nature of our relationship. I mean, he is my teacher and I am his teacher. And we are equal. We do say yes to each other. I mean, if I think that he's doing something that's not a good idea, I tell him and he listens. And I can only really speak from that experience that the relationship is incredibly equal.
This is very interesting indeed. Did it raise any eyebrows when it came out that you were together? Or actually, I'll say this, was it from that moment on Primrose Hill it was on, or was there an exploratory period? And also, when it did come out, did it raise any eyebrows? I remember when I was at your home, yourself and Ngak'chang Rinpoche told the story of how you were busted.
Yes, by Chimé Rigdzin Rinpoche. Yes. Well, I wanted to keep it secret because I wanted to get used to the idea myself. I wanted us to be able to get used to it a bit before, because as a Lama, he led a very public life in terms of the Sangha. I mean, he never kept anything secret. He just his life was an open book to everybody, and that was very obvious before the time when we were together. I hadn't even thought about that when I made this declaration of love to him. I hadn't thought, oh, well, my life's going to be like that in the future as well. So I suppose perhaps I did realize to some degree, and I did want us to be able to enjoy perhaps a month or so of time together without the thought that people were watching us all the time. But anyway, that didn't happen because, as you say, we did go to see Chimé Rigdzin Rinpoche, and Rinpoche said, well, we're not actually telling people yet. But then by the time we departed and came back to Cardiff, everybody seemed to know, and Chimé Rigdzin Rinpoche had been on the phone doing what he did best, exposing situations for what they were. He wouldn't see any need for any secrecy, or why would you need to do that? So I guess that's why he bust us open, as it were.
And how was that received?
Well, I'm not quite sure actually, because nobody ever, I mean, they wouldn't say anything to us. So you'd have to ask the apprentices that. I don't know whether people had perceived that something was happening. I really don't know. Mm-hmm. It's almost too long ago to remember, actually. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned Chimé Rigdzin Rinpoche there. And around that time, you also had contact with other lamas of various kinds. I'm not sure if you'd been to Nepal by that point and met Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche and Jomo Samphel Dechen. Had you met them yet?
No, that came later. Yeah.
So who else did you have contact with at that time?
It was mainly Chimé Rigdzin Rinpoche, actually, because I didn't meet the previous incarnation of Dudjom Rinpoche, gTer Dorje Rinpoche. I never met him, and I didn't meet Dilka Khyentse Rinpoche. Quite early on in our relationship, in fact, I think it must have been in about 1996. I met Dudjom Rinpoche. Met him on several occasions, travelled to California. In fact, I met him before 96, travelled to California with Rinpoche, and we were teaching at Pema Asaling, his retreat centre, and I met him there. And then he came to stay with us in our house here in Penarth, not this one, but the previous one. That was when Robert was a little baby. He was only 4 weeks old, and he came to give teachings on Dorje Tigdung 7-line song here in Cardiff. So it was probably mainly Chimé Rigdzin Rinpoche and him at first, and then later Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche. When we were on a pilgrimage I think it was my first time in Nepal, although I had previously been to northern India and Ladakh with my first husband on my first pilgrimage. That was in the mid-80s sometime. We went to Nepal, and we went out to Yanglisha at the invitation of Gyaltsen Rinpoche, who was another Lama that we knew at the time, who had this retreat land, and he'd built a retreat center for people. And we were having lunch there with him and all the students that were with us. And he said, would you like to meet Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche? And we said yes, or Rinpoche said yes, of course, but not knowing that Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche was the one with whom he had had contact for the past 13 years, who he'd had this incredibly close relationship with and then didn't see for 13 years. Because Kunzang Dorje is a very common name, so it crossed his mind, could it be Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche? No, it couldn't be. And then he took us upstairs and we went into his room, and it was just amazing to be a witness to that reunion. It was so lovely. He had Ngak'chang Rinpoche come sit on his bed. He kept holding his hand, rubbing his hand, and also touching his beard and touching his cheek. It was so moving to see that. And so this was the great Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche that I'd heard so much about in terms of his wrathful demeanor, which is all in wisdom eccentrics. And I couldn't believe it was the same person. Well, I could, because he looked the same as the photograph on the front of wisdom eccentrics. And he was certainly the most handsome of Rinpoche's teachers. I think Rinpoche called him the Errol Flynn of the Dharma. And yes, I could see it was the same person, but his demeanor was so different from what I had imagined. He was so kind, so nice, so gentle, so warm, so affectionate. So it was an amazing meeting. And after that, obviously, for the rest of his life, then we visited him regularly and maintained that wonderful contact, both with him and his wife, Jomo Samphel, Dechen Rinpoche.
What was your experience of Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche and Jomo Samphel Dechen Rinpoche, personally?
Well, we spent many hours sitting in his shrine room bedroom, just watching him be himself. He was always extremely kind, would answer endless questions about the Ngak'chang Rinpoche from our students and from ourselves. He took a great interest in Robert, our son, actually, because I think Robert was probably about 5 or 6 when Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche gave him his name, Dudjom Dorje, and he gave it to him on a piece of paper, which was signed and sealed, which Robert thought this was amazing, that he should have a new name and it should be written down on this piece of paper. And Robert would sit for hours in the room, and you'd think any 6-year-old boy would be completely bored with what was going on, but he was all just fascinated to sit there, just taking it all in. I mean, we had to have a translator because, I mean, he had some words of English, but not many. Jomo Samphel and Dechen Rinpoche and he would laugh a lot together. She would be coming in and out, bringing tea, biscuits, refilling our cups every time they became empty. There was one occasion when Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche gave Ngak'chang Rinpoche a janak costume, which is the costume for the tantric dance of the black hat. It's known as janak, black hat. And that was an amazing thing to happen, because it was like he was giving him the tool of the tantric master, really, the Ngak'chang costume. It's a fantastic costume. It's this huge hat, black hat with a very wide rim with flame on top. So it's almost like the hat is like a sculpture in itself. And this black costume with a tabard, beautiful. And Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche put it on himself, first of all. And I think it was important for us all to see him in the costume, to have that sort of transmission of seeing him wearing it. And then he had Ngak'chang Rinpoche put it on. So he had all his assistants putting the hat on, dressing him up, while everyone took photographs of the process. So that was a wonderful occasion. And on that occasion, Jomo Samphel gave me this Katvanga, the tantric staff. So it was like he was giving us some sort of tantric empowerment. But really, we just hung out with him in his room for hours. he didn't really give formal teachings. We would just chat and talk about things.
How do you think Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche viewed Ngak'chang Rinpoche?
Well, on that day of the reunion at Yanglisha, he kept saying, "My friend, my friend, my friend," as he was touching his face and touching his hand. I think he viewed him as his spiritual son, because they spent this intimate time together and then didn't see each other for such a long time. And then afterwards, we came back several times to Kathmandu to see him whenever we could make a pilgrimage. We did. And we would always arrive with all this entourage of students as well who were desperate to meet him. Having read the book and heard of these experiences, they just wanted to spend time with him. So yes, I think he just viewed him as a spiritual son in the West. I mean, Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche didn't have very many students. He would often, I think, to study with him or to take teachings from him, you just had to be with him. He didn't give formal teaching, so you just had to be prepared to sit there and spend time and absorb it, because he was the king of the universe, and that was seeing him in action as the king of the universe. You had to be prepared to just be there, spend time with him. I think many people would visit him and they wouldn't really particularly know how to deal with that situation. They would want something that was a little bit more concrete, something they could understand more.
Mm-hmm. They call that in show business the hang.
Do they?
No, they do actually. Do you have the hang? You know, can he hang? Why do you think Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche didn't have many students?
Well, I think he used to put them off, probably. I don't think he wanted them. I mean, he did his best to put Ngak'chang Rinpoche off, given that they were both in this situation. Because he'd received this letter from Dudjom Rinpoche, he couldn't send him away. So, and it didn't seem as if he could frighten him away by his wrathful shouting in the beginning. So I think he showed in that he wasn't really that keen on having many people around. In fact, Rinpoche's translator said, "Oh, he doesn't have many students. You're so lucky to be able to receive this teaching." So I think he just carried on throughout his life in that way. Mm-hmm. He led very much a wandering life. He would wander from place to place with Jomo Samphel, and they would stay in other people's houses, practice, go to caves, practice. So he was a wandering yogi. I think we probably saw him once his wandering days were finished. Mm-hmm. And he lived in, we met him at Yanglisha, or re-met him at Yanglisha, and then after that, we always visited him actually in Boda, where he had, he lived on the top floor of a house. Mm-hmm. He stayed there then.
When you use that term, king of the universe, can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I guess the king of the universe as universal power. And that's what he exuded. Of course, I think that's what we were looking for and perceiving because of our own idea of who he was, an emanation of Dorje Trullo. But that's what you perceived. Yeah, I think it was just that amazing sense of power that you received from him. And he wasn't even trying, you know, he was just acting in a very ordinary way. And yet there was this palpable sense of power there. I think it's almost the sense of potential power that he could bring into action if it were required with someone.
Is that, do you think, derived from personal charisma, or from his advanced Salung attainments, or from his personal realization?
I don't know whether I can answer that question particularly. No, I can't really say, honestly. I mean, I suppose if you know someone has accomplished a great deal in terms of their practice, then you're going to be much more open to perceiving that. You're going to want to perceive it as well, aren't you?
Sometimes people report in terms of, as their practice unfolds and their journey progresses, a kind of gradual shifts or changes or this sort of thing from a spiritual point of view. Other times people report watershed moments where previously it was this way, after this, it's that way. I'm curious, in terms of your own path over these decades of practicing, have there been watershed moments? And if so, what have they been? And what have been the key shifts, transformations, insights, or developments within that path?
I don't know that I really particularly want to discuss my personal practice as such. It's not something that you really do. I'd say probably the most important points for me have been when we've been on pilgrimage, because being on pilgrimage puts you in a different sort of state, because you're away from your everyday life circumstances, and you're in this special place, a place where Papas and Bar and Yeshit Sogil have walked, you know. That pilgrimage has been tremendously important to me over the years, and the people that we've met. If I think about the difference between my first pilgrimage, which really, I was a Buddhist and I was a student of Ngak'chang Rinpoche then, and I went to India for 6 weeks with my first husband. I took some unpaid leave from work so that we could go for a longer period of time, and we went to Kashmir, because you could go quite safely to Kashmir in those days, and we stayed on a houseboat in Srinagar, and then we planned our journey up north, and then down into Ladakh, and we travelled by, my first husband was quite keen on independent travel, so we did all of this ourselves, which is different from our later pilgrimages. I mean, it had its moments. We had all our cooking fuel stolen when we were on, because we went by lorry. We didn't hire a jeep or anything, and there was a road that was really bumpy that took us as far as Kargil and then down into Ladakh, and we ended up with no cooking fuel because it was stolen because it was on the top of the lorry when we were in the cab with the driver. And we had hired these pony men to carry our baggage, but we were very much a very small group. Well, it was just he and I and these two pony men, and so that was an entirely different pilgrimage from the later ones that I then did with Ngak'chang Rinpoche. If I think about the difference between them, I felt more of a traveller, like an international traveller on the first pilgrimage, whereas I felt much more on latter pilgrimages as a practitioner. I don't think I actually felt like that the first time I went to India. I think I've been to hidden lands. I mean, like I think some years ago we went to Jomo. In fact, Ngak'chang Rinpoche didn't come with me on that occasion. I went with a group of students, a small group of students, to Jomo, which is a hidden land. It's not far from Kathmandu, and it's only about 20 miles north of Kathmandu. And this idea of hidden land is it's a place that's been almost hidden in terms of practice by Pabsambhava, Guru Rinpoche and Yeshe Tsogyal, almost like Terma is hidden, hidden teachings. And then these places are opened in terms of their potential for practice. And also Bhutan is very much a hidden land. So these places for me have given me, I think, what you were describing, those intense periods where practice has seemed a lot easier than the rest of the time. So Yolmo was a place like that. We did awful lot of walking in Yolmo. And I suppose the thing about pilgrimage is that they're not always easy, but that's almost the purpose of them, that they challenge you. They also take you to a place where Buddhist practice is normal, and it's not special like it is when we live in this country. Being a Buddhist practitioner is it's not a run-of-the-mill thing to be. Whereas if you go to the East, it's quite normal. You can walk around with your tenga in your hand reciting mantra and nobody thinks anything of it. And it's very important for, I think, us to feel that affirmation of, oh, this is normal. People do this. Lots of people do this. So I think Yolmo is a very particular place like that where practice was very easy. Another place was where I had I felt a very strong connection was in Maratika. I went to the Maratika caves, which, gosh, in Himachal Pradesh. And this was another occasion actually when Ngak'chang Rinpoche couldn't come. He had to stay in the hotel because he was quite ill on that pilgrimage. And we travelled in this very small aircraft and landed in this field. And then we had this trek up to the cave where we were staying. We managed to stay in the local monastery for a few days and visit the cave. And just that cave was amazing. It was huge, vast. And it was the place where Mandarava and Pabasambhava practiced long life together. So that was our purpose in going there, was to practice long life practice there. And the funny thing was, it was just full of batshit. It was just inches thick everywhere. And you could see the bats up above and they were skittering around. And we were sat there in our white skirts in amongst the batshit practicing. It was amazing. It was great. So I think that's as far as I could go in terms of, I think those have been my most important points of practice. And of course, you know, recently last year, well, a year ago now, this time last year, we were heading out to Bhutan. That was my second visit to Bhutan. And that is just such a beautiful country. And we met so many lamas who were so positive about what we were doing as a sangha, a white-skirted, long-haired sangha, who they were so welcoming, so appreciative, and the Bhutanese people are so appreciative of the fact that we're doing this practice in the West, and they find that incredibly inspiring. So we find them inspiring, and they find us inspiring. So it was a wonderful time. And I say that I mentioned earlier that I didn't meet the previous incarnation of Dudjom Rinpoche, but I have now met the two new incarnations of Dudjom Rinpoche, Sangye Pema Shepa Rinpoche and Tenzin Yeshe Dorje Rinpoche. So to meet those two was amazing.
They seem similar, given that they're incarnations of the same person when you met them. I don't know if they know each other, do they?
I don't think they have met. No, I don't think they do seem that similar, although, I mean, I've only met them both briefly, so I wouldn't want to read too much into that. One is a monk, and the other is a Ngakma. So they have different ordinations from that point of view. But really, from the brief meeting that I've had with both of them, I couldn't really say.
Are their recognitions contentious in the same way that the 17th Karmapa has two incarnations and sort of split the Karma Kagyu?
No, not at all. Not at all. No, I think there is less politics involved here, far less politics.
So I understand you don't want to talk about your personal practice and that side of things, and that's fine. So if this is in that category of no-go topics, then just mention that's okay. But by the time you got together with Ngak'chang Rinpoche in '92, and he stepped back from formally teaching you, giving you teachings and directions and so on and so forth.
No, I wouldn't say he stepped back formally. I mean, he'd never given me an enormous number of instructions before that point. So it didn't change that markedly. I wouldn't want to give the impression that he stepped back from being the role of teacher, because he didn't really, if you understand me.
He just didn't give you any direction in what sense then? What was the stepping back that you talked about then?
I think he just became very careful. Was aware of that position now when we were having a relationship. I mean, I forget which Lama it's who said no thrones in bed. I think it might be the Dalai Lama, actually. There are no thrones in bed. So I think he was very aware of that. And I think my behavior in that period initially obviously forced him to step back a little. It was almost like I had to play with the power a bit, to control him in order that I wasn't controlled. I had to test that ground, if you like.
How did you do that?
Well, I suppose by reacting in the way that I did with the addresses. I mean, I can't remember other things that I reacted to. That was just one thing that I particularly remember. I mean, he's quite a sensitive individual, so I think he picks things up without too much difficulty.
And you mentioned that on Primrose Hill, and you made that declaration that he immediately said, well, this would mean children if we were to
mentally inside. Yes, he didn't say that. I don't think he said that verbally. Yeah.
I'm curious, having had children and being in that sort of public, having that public face. You mentioned that Ngak'chang Rinpoche has a public life, and then by default you entered into that, and then presumably having children, there's some considerations there. I'm wondering what your considerations were in terms of how your children were going to relate to that side of things growing up in that context. Did you train them specifically in religious matters, or were they shielded from the more public side, or how is it done?
Well, they always came on retreats, and do still come on. Well, Rachel still comes on retreats with us. We didn't really sit them down formally and give them teachings ever, because I believe that children absorb in an organic way. The only thing that we do every day is always sing 7-line song before meals. So that's something that they obviously grew up with. And I think coming on retreats for them was such a pleasure, because it was like having a huge family. Like all this family of uncles and aunts. And of course, they're all very nice to them. So they've had such a lot of fun on retreats. But I suppose in terms of, they came on public retreats as well. Although now, I think once they started school, it was always, it was much more difficult then, because you can't keep uprooting them from school. And Rinpoche was traveling to America for 6 weeks twice a year, and Europe as well in between. And so I then took a back seat in terms of accompanying him, and stayed at home and stayed with them. So I guess they haven't been exposed a lot publicly, but they're very much at the heart of our, well, Rachel's very much at the heart of our Sangha, and, you know, Robert was until his death in 2013. So she comes, we have, at the moment, because of the pandemic, we have a monthly Sok Kolo, which is a feast offering. We do that monthly on Zoom, and Rachel usually comes to that. She has her own friends now. I mean, she's 17 now, so she has her own friends in the Sangha, and it's great for her because she's got people she can talk to about things that she wouldn't necessarily want to talk to us about. So I think it's a wonderful way for children to grow up, having this extended family. And in this day and age, when we are all in our nuclear families, it's something that I think they've had such a bonus from, having the opportunity to have all this exposure to all these different people, because our Sangha is so varied in terms of the personalities of people and nationalities of people. And I mean, when I was 18, I hadn't travelled outside this country. I think I went interrailing before I started my degree in Cardiff. That was my first travels abroad. Whereas Robert, he travelled to America when he was a month old, but they've been all over the place because of the nature of our work, which I think that they're very lucky to have been able to do that.
Does Rachel have an interest in following in the family business, I suppose?
No, she wants to be an artist.
Oh.
She wants to study art.
What medium?
Well, she's exploring everything at the moment. She will, hopefully next year, she'll go to Art Foundation, where she'll be able to explore more widely. That's what her plan is anyway. So I guess you could say she's in the family business in terms of the sense of art that we have. Mm-hmm. I know that I think art is very important to her because she can see that it, I mean, Rinpoche went to art college. He's always been talking about art from, I've got recordings of retreats that he gave back in the early 80s, and he was talking about art then and the importance of art in terms of Vajrayana, how it is the artistic branch as opposed to science and philosophy, which is more the sutric approach, way of life. So she's been exposed to so much of that it's obviously rubbed off on her. And I guess as a family, we're musical. We both play instruments, and she plays instruments. So, and a lot of the Sangha are artistic. They produce amazing craft work. And they're amazing musicians as well. So I think she's grown up in that enriched environment, which has been great. But I wouldn't say she's had formal Buddhist teaching, other than having attended some teachings and maybe leant against the wall and maybe gone to sleep a little bit, but sometimes comes up with questions that she wants answers to. So I guess I hope she'll continue to have continued involvement in the Sangha. I think she's very much in love. We have this retreat centre now, Dralajong, in just north of Carmarthen, and she's very much involved there with wanting to be involved in terms of the land, planning the land management and how we're going to really manage it in terms of promoting the wildlife there, you know, obviating the effects of climate change. And she's very much into all of that.
And you yourself are quite an accomplished tanka painter.
Well, actually, I wouldn't say I'm an accomplished tanka painter at all. No, I spend all of my time drawing now, producing line drawings. When I first started off, years ago, this was just before Robert was born, so it must have been about 95. I did draw and paint then, because at that point we didn't have anyone else who was painting, so I thought, well, I'll have a go at that. But there is, I mean, although the Arrow Tear is a small Terma tradition, there is a great deal of imagery, and there are so many yidams that I want to extract from Rinpoche's mind and bring into being, that it makes, because I live here with him, and he directs how they are supposed to look, what implements they hold, what positions they're in. It makes kind of more sense for me to be producing all those images that then other people paint. So that's why my role has moved into producing the images, and our small band of tanka painters who we've trained paint the images. And I would say they are much better tanka painters than I was, because really I probably didn't paint that many tankas. And they're far better than I am. So Rinpoche and I produce the images together. What I do is, well, he gives me a basic instruction of how they are to manifest, and I go then away and look for references. We've got a number of Tibetan art books. I mean, there are these weighty tomes of Tibetan art reference books, all these yidams drawn in the gTer, the grid line system. And I've got three main books that I use as references for those. We've acquired one recently, which is a work of that was directed really by Sangye Gyatso, the regent for the fifth Dalai Lama, who was very much, he produced a lot of, directed a lot of tanka painters and produced this book of reference work, and the images in there are fantastic. They're really, really, really lively. They've got beautiful hands, beautiful faces as well, the wrathful faces in particular. So I use that as my major reference work at the moment. And then I get that on paper with the implements, and then it goes over to Rinpoche, then he scans it, and then he beautifies it in terms of thinning out the lines. We can play around with the facial expressions, because the facial expression is tremendously important, because if you don't like the face, you're not going to find it as a source of inspiration. And after all, that's what these images are for. They are visualization aids for practitioners. So if you don't find it inspiring, it's not going to help you if it doesn't communicate with you. And he adds the odd implement in terms of Photoshop. He works in Photoshop. So he probably spends almost as long on the image as I do. And then we have this end result, which can then be passed on to be painted or just published as a line drawing. That's how we produce them.
Another area of particular interest for you has been Kum-Nye.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what it is that, of all the practices that are available, the whole menu of possibilities, why it was that Kum-Nye in particular attracted your interest and attention.
Well, I've always liked using my body, actually. I've always been a physical person. I've always liked keeping fit as well. I mean, I'm not that fit, but so I suppose to have an exercise system that you can both use for practice, for meditation practice, and use your body and keep fit is the ideal combination, because I'd rather be practicing Kum-Nye or the other physical practices than going out for a run, say. So I think it's just pragmatic, really. I mean, the Kum-Nye is very interesting because it makes you use your body in completely unpatterned ways, because you'll often be rotating your nose in very tiny circles. You'll be keeping some of your limbs locked, like your arms, and yet everything else will be moving. So the word is disorientation. That's the word I want. So they actually disorientate you. And that's actually the nature of the practice. So that's such an interesting physical experience, really.
Does that disorientation effect still hold when you acquire the neuromuscular pattern?
Yes, I think so, because it's not the normal way that one would use one's body. And actually, when you've acquired that expertise, as it were, it means that one can actually practice then instead of practicing the practice. Until you build that up, you can't really experience the effects or give yourself the opportunity to experience the effects.
Oh, that's interesting. So when you've acquired the movement pattern, that doesn't diminish the shock value of the disorientation. No. How can that be the case? How can one be disoriented in a movement pattern that one has acquired in the body?
Oh gosh, what a question. Because it's the effect on your energetic system, your Tsalung system. So I'm not sure this is something that I can explain very easily. It's a shaking up of the energy that's traveling in the system of channels in our body, that's then that's meeting or kind of smashing into the nature of pattern. And that is what produces the profound effect that one then focuses on entirely. That becomes the focus of meditation in the meditation posture, which is this, I don't know how much you know about Kum-Nye, but you perform the exercise and then you lie down in the meditation posture and your focus is on physical sensation, what is arising. So that's what's happening. That's the actual practice. So it's the shaking up of the Tsalung system by the nature of these exercises.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. My last question for you is, you mentioned before that people like to see a woman teach or like to see a woman speak. And I'm wondering, as a woman practitioner and teacher of several decades, to what degree do you think that appreciation comes from the student's ability to relate or the student's own filters? And to what extent do you think something unique can be brought from a woman's point of view or perspective? I'm wondering if you could speak more to that point that you only touched on earlier in the interview.
Well, actually, I don't think that. I kind of have a bit of a fundamental problem with seeing, identifying a group of people like women or men and giving them, applying characteristics to them which are either beneficial or not beneficial. I prefer to see people as individuals. So I don't think that women as a group have anything above and beyond men as a group to give, because I see them as a bunch of individuals. You see, the sphere that we're in here, Vajrayana, is Tantra. So the method involves is empty form. So that empty form comes in a myriad of different forms. So you have multiplicity here. So you have infinite numbers of methods, like infinite numbers of teachers, lamas, infinite numbers of symbols in terms of the awareness imagery. And they speak individually to infinite numbers of people, because transformation that we're talking about in Vajrayana is about communication. And it's about transformation, and those symbols will only speak to, I mean, a symbol is a method, and by virtue of being a method, it's limited in its applicability. So there'll be some women who will speak to some individuals, and some men who speak to some individuals. So I'm not quite sure that I see that women have got something to offer that men haven't. But I can see how in a patriarchal society, that's where I think women like to have women teachers as role models. And I think that patriarchy has put us in this situation where women really like to have female teachers, and men too. I mean, I can't speak for men because I'm not a man, but in actual fact, in terms of Tantra, women are teachers for men and men are teachers for women, because the nature of teaching from the Tantric perspective incites one's own hidden, unmanifest quality, which for me, because I'm, by virtue of being a woman, my unmanifest quality is a power quality, the realized male principle. Externally, I'm the realized female principle. So my teacher, from a tantric perspective, should be a man, to incite that, and for men, vice versa.
So when you're saying that, your earlier comment about people like to see a woman teacher, in that sense, it's a symbol rather than a specific woman. Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, I'm not dismissing the fact that we haven't had this wealth of female teachers. I mean, certainly they're not present in the East. And I mean, another point here is that we are a female lineage. The lineage holders through the lineage, a lot of them are women. So I guess one expects to see female teachers in this female lineage.
What were you thinking of then when you said people like to see women teachers? You're talking about your own reluctance to teach. That was the context in which that comment arose. That's the comment that I'm kind of pointing to.
Well, I think because I suppose I'm speaking from the fact that I mean, when I was in my teens, we still lived in very much a patriarchal society. I mean, we've come so far, haven't we, in my adult life. I mean, my father, because he had two daughters, he didn't expect us to go to university. And I don't think he was unusual. I think he thought that we would end up as secretaries, or we would work in shops. And I'm not quite sure that how unusual that was for men of his class to think at that time. But my mother was much more encouraging of us educationally, and she really thought that we should go to university and study and get a higher education. So I think I'm speaking back to that time, because that's been the experience of my life. I mean, there's been so much change. My sister was, when we were growing up in the family, she was quite a strident political feminist. I wasn't. She did all that bit for me. But I felt quite sorry for my poor father, because he lived in this house with 3 women. He didn't have much of a voice. But, you know, in some ways, that political feminism has, I think I feel sorry that men these days have had to put up with so much bashing from political feminists over the years. I mean, I feel it's not, we don't need to come at it from that point of view. We don't need to pull people down. I mean, I love men. I think they're great. But I think as a result of the years of political feminism, a lot of men don't feel appreciated by women. And I think there are a number of women who don't like men very much. And that is sad, but this sadness comes about because you put people into groups of men and women rather than seeing them as individuals. So it's always a problem. So this putting people into groups, it's sort of primitive behavior. It's what herds of animals do in order to keep themselves safe, isn't it? They have to recognize the predators. They have to be able to identify predators as a group in order to keep themselves safe. Now, we don't need to keep ourselves safe really at that level. And yet we continually go back to this primitive way of keeping ourselves safe. And it's really not necessary. I mean, one can live with insecurity.
What do you mean one can live with insecurity?
Well, that's the nature of practice. That's the end result of practice, is being stable with whatever happens in your life. We're not, because situations come into being and go out of being. People come and go, people live and die. They are born and they die. We need to remain stable with what life throws at us. And by that, I don't mean that we're not sad when things like that happen, but we don't have to complicate the sadness. Make it into a big project, a big hairy thing that it doesn't have to be.
You mentioned the word patriarchy. That word has many different meanings, I think, both politically, historically, and so on. It's been used in different ways. But some people do see this idea of patriarchal society or system as being really quite an existential threat. Perhaps that drives some of the tribalism, this group behavior.
Mm.
When you use the word patriarchy, how do you use the word? How are you thinking of that concept when you use that?
Well, just the fact that men have held the power. I mean, I don't think they do so much now at all, not compared to when I was young. It's political power, financial power, power in all its ramifications. I mean, I live in a Sangha where that's not the case. So I'm really probably not that qualified to speak about this anyway, because I don't have a job that takes me out into the office or the hospital ward, so I'm not really the Sangha that we have, because of the practice, is incredibly equal. In fact, I suppose we have more female teachers than male ones, really. And the two genders have great respect from one another because they learn from each other. So I can only really speak to what my own experience is, which has been sort of being part of this Sangha for 40 years. It's probably given me a somewhat unrealistic picture of the world. So I would prefer not to comment on something I'm not part. Well, it's not that I'm not part of the world, but I don't have that worst experience of the world because I'm sheltered really from it, I think. You know, I'd like everyone to have this experience of being part of something where the genders really truly respect each other for both their similarities and their differences, because they're seen as individuals to be appreciated, not as you're a man and I'm a woman. Because I think there's far more commonality between the genders than there is difference, actually. But it's so tempting to split people and talk about difference rather than similarity. I think if you look at a man's brain and a woman's brain, they'll look pretty much the same anatomically. You know, I really have always wanted to undermine this idea of men are from Mars and women are from Venus. I think that was the most tremendously unhelpful book that was ever written in terms of men and women getting along with each other and being partners and living with harmony and mutual respect.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Khandro Déchen, thank you very much.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.